13. The handsome face of Elvis Aaron Presley was puffed and bloated. His eyes were narrow slits, and they were crimson. He was sitting on a giant-sized bed in the purple-walled bedroom that he and Gladys Presley had decorated with an adventurous enthusiasm. The white trim had somehow dulled. The old fittings had suddenly lost their luster. Sitting on a makeshift bed next to the master bed was Nick Adams, the brilliant young rebel actor who was to end his life in suicide. Nick was now at Presley's side when the young superstar needed him most. Presley was afraid to sleep alone. He wanted Nick there to sleep with him for company. A doctor had just given Presley a shot to sedate him, but the pain wouldn't let him sleep. Red West walked into the bedroom with a lump the size of a golf ball in his throat. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he found it hard to speak without bursting into tears. He closed the door gently behind him, looked at Presley silently. He strode quickly toward him. Presley half staggered to his feet. Both men collapsed into each other's arms, their fingers digging into each other's back. "Mama's gone. Red. My mama's gone. Red. What will I do? I've lost everything. There ain't nothing to live for. She was everything. Without her I got nothing. It's all over, man." Red couldn't talk for a long moment. "I know, she was a fine woman, and now I've lost my daddy. He's gone, too." The two men held each other in an embrace that only other men can understand. Never before had Red West and Elvis Presley been so close as in this moment of profound loss. On August 14th, 1958, Gladys Presley died at the age of 42 from a heart attack triggered by acute hepatitis. 8 hours later, Red West's father, Newton Thomas West, also died. "I just can't explain how close I felt to him that moment," says Red. "Man, he was hurting and I was hurting. I knew what he was going through. I knew how much he had loved that woman. Because I loved her, too. And I loved my daddy too." That was one hell of a day. Outside Graceland in the flat, oppressive Memphis summer heat, 500 people, a respectful gathering of loyal worshippers, stood silent vigil along what now has become Elvis Presley Boulevard. Elsewhere in Memphis, more than 2,000 Presley fans had streamed into the city from as far away as New York and Boston. Some of the people, unable to find accommodations, stayed on the couches or in the spare rooms of complete strangers who happened to live in Memphis. There was a magnitude to the mourning that could be compared only to that given a head of state or a national hero. There were telegrams of sympathy from heads of state. Hollywood superstars flooded Graceland with telephone calls and telegrams. Somehow the legendary bond between Presley and his mother was something known in the most obscure places to the most obscure people. The year 1958 had already surrounded Presley in hysterical controversy. He had signed a gigantic contract with Hal Wallace of Paramount to star in King Creole. The movie, thought to be a cut above the rest of Presley's acting offerings, was based loosely on the Harold Robbins best-seller A Stone for Danny Fisher. Presley would be paid $500,000 and would receive 50% of the profits. It was his biggest deal to date, although his movie deals would get a lot bigger. Presley was in the midst of another, less profitable big deal. His earnings, in fact, were about to drop from about $125,000 a month to $78 a month. His employer, the U.S. Army. Public protest was overwhelming. If the volume of mail to the Pentagon and fan club demonstrations were standards by which to judge, teenagers picketed recruiting depots, and many of the 15,000 letters received by the U.S. government accused them of plotting to place Presley and Dan Gare of being killed or injured. The Pentagon actually had a file marked Operation Presley. It was madness of the most humorous proportions. Senators and congressmen, anxious for space in their hometown newspapers, got on the bandwagon. Although no one had suggested otherwise, the wise men of Washington wanted reassurance that Presley would be given no special treatment in the U.S. Armed Services. One reporter with an eye for an angle really put the fox among the chickens when he quoted an anonymous Army source as assuring him that Presley would be spared the regulation Army haircut and would be comfortably ensconced in the U.S. Special Services, which has the responsibility of entertaining the troops. The source pointed out that this was the route chosen for Vic Damone and Eddie Fisher. It was not necessarily the route chosen by Damone and Fisher. After all, they were giving away for nothing what they had been paid a lot of money for. It was a point that did not escape the eagle eye of Colonel Tom Parker. Presley, for his part, was the model of public relations. He managed to quiet the roars from Washington. "All I want to do is to be treated like an ordinary GI," he said. "I want to do my duty and I'm mighty proud to be given the opportunity to serve my country." So everything died down, but the sawdust was still to hit the fan. When Presley received his notice to report to the induction center in Memphis, almost $300,000 had already been spent in pre-location shooting for King Creole. If Presley was to in the Army as scheduled, the movie would have to go be scrapped. At the urging of Wallace and Colonel Tom, Presley wrote to the Pentagon in the most respectful terms asking for a 3-month deferment. Deferments, particularly in 1958, were extremely common. They were given on grounds of everything from hardship to college education. No big deal. That is, until the news leaked out, and the bleats again came loud and clear from Washington. State Representative Nick Johnson, of Harlan, Kentucky, got more publicity than ever in his life when he resigned from the local draft board with the protest, "I cannot conscientiously ask any mountain boy to serve the country unless afforded the same treatment as Presley." Well, everybody had their say. The deferment was granted, and Presley finished his film. 7 months before Gladys Presley died, while Elvis was involved with the film's pre-location shooting, Red West had visited at Graceland. He was on leave from the Marine base in Norfolk, Virginia. "While I was there," says Red, "she got on the telephone and called Elvis. He was glad to say hello, and when he found I had about 2 weeks leave, he invited me to come to Hollywood and spend some time with him. Great. I had never been to a studio before. I was to leave the next day." After the telephone call, Mrs. Presley and I sat and talked some more. "Man, I knew there was something wrong with her. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was just the way she talked. Man, that dear lady knew she was dying. She never said anything like that, but the way she was talking, it was as if it was all over. She knew she didn't have long. When I got up to say goodbye, she just sort of called me back, and she said what I had heard her say 100 times. 'Bob, look after my boy.' When she said it this time, it was different. There was a sort of, I don't know, a sort of finality to the sound of her voice, like as if that was the last time she would ever say it to me. It was with an eerie feeling of sadness that Red boarded a plane the next day. When I arrived in Hollywood, Elvis had one of his gophers pick me up at the airport, and he drove me straight to the studio. I met up with him and we had a happy reunion. Man, there I was, a cut hick son of a bitch in a Marine uniform on a Paramount movie set. I was really wide-eyed. Elvis took me around and showed me how things worked, and I was really impressed. They had 2 more days shooting in Hollywood, and then they were going on to New Orleans for location. Elvis asked me whether I would like to come along. Man, would I? The party was to leave by train. Presley wouldn't fly. Red recalls, a year earlier he had the scare of his life. He was traveling over the Ozarks in a small plane going from one gig to the next, and the way he told it to me, suddenly this damn plane just lost all its power. The pilot couldn't do a thing about it. The pilot even was convinced they were going to crash and all get killed. Elvis said he was getting ready to die. He was sure that it was the end. Luckily, they made a forced landing and nobody got hurt, but it scared Elvis half to death. When his mother found out about it, she made him promise never to fly. He wasn't too keen on flying then. Of course, later he lost that fear and bought himself almost his own Air Force. At one time he had 5 planes and 4 pilots. Red boarded the train with Presley, Colonel Tom, co-star Carolyn Jones, her husband, Aaron Spelling, then a struggling writer but soon to become Hollywood's biggest TV producer. Also along was Alan Fortas, one of Presley's Memphis Mafia. Alan, a husky, jovial young man, was from Memphis. His uncle was former Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas. Gene Smith, Presley's cousin, was there, too. Man, for me, says Red, this was a dream trip, with all those important people. He stayed with Presley for a week, and the actors and crew treated him like one of them. I knew then that I wanted to be connected to this life, says Red. I didn't know what as, maybe an extra or a stunt man or anything, but I wanted in on this. Between takes, Walter Matthau, who had joined the group in New Orleans, would lead the cast and crew in card games, and that led to the first mint that Presley ever made to Red for his services up to then. The Colonel, Elvis, Mr. Matthau and some others were playing blackjack. Mr. Matthau went broke and wanted to play on credit. He wasn't as a pretty rich man. Nobody seemed to mind, except the Colonel. He was just as tough with cards as he was with business. The old Colonel just said flat out, "No, you want to play cards, you play with cash." And that was it. Mr. Matthau may have been a big movie star, but when it came to playing cards with the Colonel, it was cash or nothing. Elvis then won a hand for $50. He just handed it to me and said, "Here, Red, buy a few beers." Like a dumbass, that night I picked up this gal, and when we went back to the hotel room I went to the bathroom. I didn't know much about those kind of ladies at the time. While I was in the bathroom, she went through my pockets and took the $50. When I came out there was no lady, no money. It taught me a lesson. 99. On March 24, 1958, at 6:30 in the morning, Elvis Aaron Presley arrived at the Memphis Draft Board AC accompanied by his mother, father, and faithful friend Lamar Fike. Lamar wanted to join the Army with Presley. The Army doctors took one look at the scales and told a disappointed Lamar that he wouldn't be Army material until he shed some of the poundage. Newspapermen from all over the country, as well as Canada, England and Australia, were on hand to record the induction of America's biggest entertainment name. Dodging photographers, who desperately tried to get a shot of Presley in the altogether as he was going through his physical. He yes sir'd and no sir'd his way through what seemed a never-ending barrage of ridiculous questions from the intelligent members of the Fourth Estate. Would he buy suede combat boots? Would he sing while he was marching to boost morale? Would he ask fans to send him Southern fried chicken? There seemed no end to it. Meanwhile, Colonel Tom was handing out 8 by 10 glossy photographs of Presley in the upcoming movie King Creole. He never missed a beat, this colonel. Later that day the king of rock and roll became Private Presley US 53,310,761, and a nation of girls mourned as he was herded onto a bus with other recruits to boot camp at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, with a flotilla of pressmen following. At Fort Chaffee, it was the same scene over again. When an army barber cannibalized the famous hairdo, Presley smiled, and Colonel Tom looked at the locks on the floor and commented, "I know a lot of people who would pay a lot of money for that hair." If life in Fort Chaffee was tough for the superstar, he went out of his way to make it look like he was enjoying every minute of it. He wasn't, of course, as Red was to find out. He took a lot of razzing from his fellow recruits, but after a while, when it didn't get anything but a shy smile, they forgot who he was and let him be another one of the boys. After 6 weeks at Fort Chaffee, he was transferred to Fort Hood. While he was behaving outwardly like just another GI, he was also making sure Army life would resemble a life in Memphis as much as possible. He rented a 4-bedroom bungalow in a town called Killeen and installed his mother, father, grandmother, Minnie Presley, Lamar Fike and any of the Memphis boys, or girls for that matter, who dropped by. The house was a center of jam sessions, gospel singing groups and record parties. Nothing wild, mind you, but a little bit better than living in the barracks. Already he was mocking plans to have his entire family come with him to Germany. It was in July of that year that the Presley family noticed the serious change in Gladys Presley. She was having trouble moving around. Her face was a deathly color, and the normally energetic and jovial woman seemed to have lost her spark. It was decided that she and Vernon should return to Memphis by train and check with the family doctor. Nobody was overly worried. After all, she was a robust woman of 42. Rest and a little specialist treatment would make things right. 4 days after arriving in Memphis, doctors at Memphis Methodist Hospital told Vernon Presley that his wife was suffering from hepatitis. On August 11th, Vernon Presley called his son in Fort Hood and told him his mother was on the serious list. Presley got emergency leave and, despite his terror of planes, boarded the first flight out to Memphis. He arrived at the hospital and waded through a battery of fans and reporters who were keeping a hospital vigil. Something told Presley that his mother was more than just serious. When he arrived at her bedside, she rallied for the first time since she had been hospitalized. The young Presley kept a 36-hour vigil at her bedside. Midnight Wednesday night, August 13th. He went home to get some sleep, and Vernon took over the bedside watch. 3 hours later he called his son with the news. His mother had died of a heart attack. Presley arrived at the hospital in a state of shock. He threw himself across his mother's bed and sobbed convulsively. When he emerged from the hospital, he could only mumble answers to newsmen at the scene. Back at Graceland, he stood for long minutes looking up at the building, then wandered through the house aimlessly. When Red West heard the news on the radio in camp at Norfolk, Virginia the next morning, he went to his commanding officer and asked for emergency leave. "I had taken up all my leave time, as I only had 2 weeks left in the service. I couldn't get a weekend leave pass because Memphis was too far away from Virginia. I didn't know what to do. I just couldn't sit there in camp and not pay my respects." 99 Fate worked a nasty twist. 3 hours later he got a call from his brother to say that his father, Newton Thomas West, was critically ill. Again he went to his commanding officer for emergency leave. This time it was granted. He couldn't get a direct flight, only a plane that took him to Atlanta, Georgia. From there I hoped I could hitch a service flight or just hitch a ride. From Atlanta, he called home. It was too late. His father had already gone. When he arrived in Memphis later that night, the whole city was in mourning. Not for him, of course, but that's the way it struck him. Red, busy organizing his father's affairs, could not attend the funeral for Mrs. Presley. Vernon Presley had arranged for a chartered plane to bring the Blackwood Brothers, Mrs. Presley's favorite gospel group, from North Carolina to sing at her funeral service. Elvis Presley remained standing throughout, in a daze of grief. After the funeral, Red broke from his own mourning to pay respects to Presley at Graceland. The next day, at the same funeral parlor where Mrs. Presley was laid out, Red had to say farewell to his father. Red will never forget what happened, not because of his own loss but because of something Presley did. Man, he had gone through a trial the day before at the funeral home. He was out of it. But just before the service started, Elvis appeared at the doorway. He was with Alan Fortas and Gene Smith and Lamar Fike. They were all very respectfully dressed. Elvis almost had to be carried over to me. He was there to mourn the passing of my dad. Damn, Man, that took something. He came over to me and sort of half fell into my arms. My mama was here yesterday just where your daddy is, Red, Elvis told me. He couldn't say too much more. He was so badly broken up. We just sort of held onto each other and I thought, this is one hell of a guy to go through what he did the day before and then face it all over again to pay his respects to my daddy. Southerners can be great like that. I was never closer to any man in my life than that day. Red returned to Norfolk, Virginia, to serve his remaining 2 weeks in the Marines. Presley went back to Fort Hood and basic training. He had to forget, although he knew that was impossible. Red recalls, Elvis erected a great big monument at the Memphis Cemetery in Forest Lawn. It's a beautiful monument, big but showy. There's a big marble statue of Jesus erected over where she is buried. When Elvis is in Memphis, he always goes there to pay his respects. He never forgets. There are always fresh flowers there. Everybody breaks up when he loses a mother or a father. With Elvis, I think it was a lot deeper. It was a heck of a shock to lose her when she was so young. Elvis had planned so much for her. He was going to take her to Germany with him. They were going to tour Europe together. She was going to be the best looked, after mother in the world. And then this. In the years to come, Presley gradually grew into a different person than he'd been before his mother's death. People close to him couldn't help speculating that her loss had more than a little to do with it. I just can't help feel, says Red West, that if she had lived, Elvis wouldn't have gotten into some of the habits he did. There was always that thought in the back of his mind, what would Mama say if she knew I was doing this? 99. Back in Fort Hood, Presley held open house in his home in Killeen. Lamar Fike was there, and Alan Fortis. Sometimes his old girlfriend Anita Wood would drop by, as would Nick Adams and Cliff Cleaves. Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Presley, a feisty old Southern lady, had now become the matriarch of the house, taking over the duties of cooking and organizing the cleaning. A week after Red West got out of the Marines, Presley invited him to come to Killeen. He was trying anything to forget, and often the house was awake until the early hours of the morning with impromptu singing and gospel sessions. No booze, no dope, no fast ladies, pretty clean fun. Red remembers, sometimes a whole team of us would sit around with a guitar and sing ourselves hoarse. Gladys Presley had always fortified her son with the belief that things would get better. It would be true as far as his career was concerned, but not necessarily for Presley personally. Suddenly he was a ship without a rudder. Presley had been in the 2nd Armored Division. Now the Army announced that his unit would make up a replacement in Germany in the 3rd Armored Division, General Patton's old outfit. Private Presley was assigned to the scouts in the division. If anyone had speculated that he might have gone into special services, they were surprised to hear of his posting, which even in peacetime Germany was the least cushy place in the Army. Later it emerged that it was the Army, and not Colonel Tom, who wanted Presley in the special services. They want my boy to sing, said the colonel. Then they are going to have to pay for it like anyone else. Colonel Tom took a giant gamble. Anybody who knew show business as well as he did knew that there was every danger of Presley's being a flash in the pan. That when the kids grew out of their Presley phase, his boy might have nowhere to go. The gamble he took was to take Presley completely out of show business for the entire 2 years he was in the service. The psychology was double-edged, risky, but brilliant if it worked. First, with the right timing, the public would grow progressively hungrier for his boy when he came out of the service, provided he stoked the publicity machinery at home. Second, Colonel Tom knew it was time to expand Presley's audience to a grown-up group. If the chips fell the right way, Presley could emerge from his Army exile with the loyalty of his established fans plus the millions more of an older group. And what better way to attract an older crowd than have the boy in the Army, and in the toughest division in the U.S. Army, and thereby convince them his boy was a responsible citizen who put flag and country before anything else. Red relates, I always had a suspicion that the old colonel maneuvered so Elvis would be in the 3rd Armored Division just so as nobody could say that he was a soft delinquent type guy. In the middle of September, 1958, Presley got his marching orders. He was to go by train to Brooklyn Navy Yard and join U.S. troop ship General Randall. We were all there to see him off. Red remembers, his dad, Minnie Presley, Lamar, myself and Anita Wood. It had been decided that Vernon and Minnie would follow Elvis over to Germany when he settled in and Elvis would live off base. The farewells were going strong and Elvis gave Anita a good-bye kiss. And then Presley did something quite unpredictable. He turned to Red and Lamar, and just about his last words were, how you all like to come across. Lamar and Red looked at each other, and before they could speak, Presley added, now, my daddy will fix up the tickets. When Daddy and Grandma Minnie come across, you fly across with them. We'll have ourselves a ball. 14. While the rest of the world recognizes that Elvis Aaron Presley is something more than an ordinary human being, the one person who believes that most passionately is Presley himself. He is addicted to the study of the Bible, mystical religion, numerology, psychic phenomena, and the belief in life after death. He firmly believes he has the powers of psychic healing by the laying on of hands. He believes he will be reincarnated. He believes he has the strength of will to move clouds in the air. And he is also convinced that there are beings on other planets. He firmly believes he is a prophet who was destined to lead, designated by God for a special role in life. If it sounds a little bizarre, Sonny West, Red West and Dave Hebler, who have sat with him for hours discussing religion and philosophy, are prepared to believe he does have great powers to control. He believes there was a master plan, says Red, by God in singling him out for his fantastic success. Now, while it does sound a little wacky, I have often given it a lot of thought and have often felt that maybe there was something to it. I mean, how does it happen that a skinny little kid from a poor family in Tupelo, Mississippi, suddenly becomes the best no name in the world? How is it that he commands all these fortunes and has all these millions of people who love him? I don't know. I'm not overly religious, but it does have a ring to it that maybe this all was destined. It was almost magic that Elvis and Colonel Tom got together. That seemed destined. I often felt that I'm in the aura of some very special human being. He genuinely believes that he is a prophet and we were his disciples. He demands fanatical loyalty, expects it. There have been times that I have felt that Elvis bordered on being a bit of a nut. But look at the loyalty we gave the man. We broke our backs for him. We've risked our lives for him. I have risked getting my ass head blown off for him. He certainly had a power over us. He certainly had a control over me. I admit it. We didn't do it for the money, because we never got much. We didn't do it for the women, because we had all had that and we were all married. We didn't do it for the excitement, because we were all a bit old for that kind of thing. I mean, he had me going where I was making telephone calls about getting Mike Stone hit. I am no killer, but I would have broken arms and legs for him. He really affected me. If I had a blow up with him or we argued, it would get so that I would get into a mood and go out and get in a fight and kick some guy's ass. It was crazy, but I did it. He could reduce us to tears, and he could get us praying for him when we thought he was hurting himself. That's the way it was. 99. All three men believe that in another time Presley could have been a great evangelist or even a politician. Dave Hebler relates, I have seen him manipulate crowds like he was Hitler. It was weird, man. Presley's fascination with death and the life hereafter, perhaps triggered by the death of his mother, borders on the frighteningly bizarre. His loss was so great that, to ease the pain, he believed she came back in another life. He believes in reincarnation but not for everybody, Sonny says. He believes that only strong people who show they have power on Earth will be reincarnated. He would often say, if you are powerful enough on Earth and are strong enough, you will come back. Weak people can't bring themselves back from the dead. Only strong people. 999. His fascination with human corpses is downright terrifying. Red recalls, there was a very nice guy, a Memphis policeman who ended up an inspector. His name was Woodward. Well, he took a real fatherly interest in Elvis right from when he just left school. They were very close. Well, in 1961, the good old guy died. I'm sure Elvis was sad about the whole thing, but do you know what he did, man? He watched a mortician embalm his friend, this old man Woodward. Can you imagine that? Someone watching someone else slicing into the body of a friend. Elvis could tell us details about embalming that would impress a doctor. He knew all the right terms, and he would tell us how a body is bled and blood is taken out and replaced by the embalming fluid. It used to make me sick. There were other things that were weird too. When he was at funerals, he would act in the most strange way. I'm not talking about his mother's funeral, because he was genuinely shattered, but even way back in 1964, when Dewey Phillips, the disc jockey, died, the guy who got Elvis all the breaks. Well, Elvis is at Dewey's funeral, and suddenly he got a fit of the giggles, just laughed his head off. I've seen him at other times start cracking jokes. Sonny West's experiences with Presley were even more bizarre. He would love to go on these damn trips through graveyards, says Sonny. He would just tell us to see if we could scare ourselves. He's pulled up on a dark road with Red and just walked down a lonely road to feel the experience of being scared. But worst of all was his trips to funeral homes. He used to return to the funeral home where his mother was laid out, on Union Avenue in Memphis. I don't mean he would just go there during the day and look around. I mean he would go there at 3 in the morning and wander around the slabs looking at all the embalmed bodies. It scared the shit out of me. One night in 1972, Presley, as was his practice, took over the Memphian Theater to see a movie. Sonny relates, Elvis loves horror movies, so this night we see a horror movie, and it must have got his mind working. Anyway, Linda Thompson was there this night. It's about 3 in the morning. We all hop in the car and suddenly Elvis says, let's go down to Union Avenue. Already, I've got it in my mind what he wants to do. We pull up outside the funeral home. We go around the back, and Elvis is leading the way as calm as if he was going to a movie. Anyway, 3 in the morning, the door is wide open and we just walk in. Elvis, Linda and me. I can't believe there is no security guard or something, but we don't see a person. Anyway, Elvis just wanders around calm as anything, trying doors to some offices. Some are locked, others are opened. I've got my jacket open ready to go for my gun. I'm scared some security guy is going to come along, see us, think it's a robbery or that we're grave robbers or something and start blazing away. I'm as nervous as a cat, because we don't see anyone and it's dark and eerie. Then I get the shock of my life. We come into this big room with heads sticking from under sheets. They were bodies, and they were sort of tilted upward, feet first. This was the damn embalming room. I'm horrified. But this was apparently what Elvis was looking for. He is happy he has found the room. Then he starts lecturing us on how people get embalmed. He is walking around and lifting up the sheets looking at the bodies, and he is telling us all the cosmetic things the morticians do when people are in accidents. He is showing us the various veins, the jugular veins and things like that, how a body is bled. Then he shows us where the bodies were cut, and because the cuts don't heal, there is only the stitches holding the body together. He led us into another room, and he is still lifting up the sheets pointing out various things that have been done to the bodies. Well, man, I'm flipping. First of all, I'm convinced that a security guard is going to come in and start blasting away at us, and the whole thing is making me sick. I mean, 3 o'clock in the morning on a tour of a mortuary. Damn madness. In the meantime, Linda Thompson is just as interested as can be. She is oohing and eyeing and saying, "Oh, my goodness, will you look at that," in that sweet little southern accent of hers. It didn't seem to affect her. Well, we were there about 45 minutes, and nobody so much as showed a face. It was amazing nobody was around, but it just shows you what a night out with Elvis might end up like. Red has also been with him on trips to embalming rooms, and I know he used to hate it. But that's what Elvis wanted and you just went along with it. Dave Hebler says Elvis has the same fascination with birth. Dave was driving Presley, Linda Thompson and Dick Robb, another bodyguard and former Palm Springs policeman, to a movie in the spring of 1975. We were going to the Memphian for a private showing. Linda mentions that her brother Sam Johnson and his wife Louise have just had a baby. She is talking about how thrilled she is, and suddenly, at 1 in the morning, Elvis decides to go see the baby. We finally get in the back entrance and, once inside the hospital, we're causing a riot. Nurses are dropping patients everywhere and running to get his autograph. Anyway, it's against hospital rules for strangers to come and look at a baby at 1 in the morning. But Elvis cons the nurse and, sure enough, we get the baby. Then someone wakes up the mother, Louise, and she comes out. Then her husband Sam is brought to the hospital to join the party. Then Linda's parents show up. Then there are the doctors and nurses. We had a convention here. Anyway, down the hallway there is a bit of activity. Elvis sees some doctors and nurses wheeling this woman along on one of those mobile stretchers. She is yelling in pain. I notice she is in labor, and they are rushing to get her into the delivery room. The next thing I know, Elvis has stopped the emergency charge toward the delivery room and starts talking to the lady. Here she is in labor, but Elvis comes along and she starts flipping out despite the pain. Anyway, as he sees her in pain, he lays his hands on her stomach, and he starts saying serious in a sort of mystical way, "Now, there, it won't hurt anymore. It won't hurt anymore. Everything is going to be fine. You're not going to hurt anymore." He's laying on the hands and taking the pain from her. Well, that might sound pretty ridiculous for a woman in labor, but the funny thing was she is saying, "You're right. The pain is gone. You're right." Well, the doctors there are doing flips. They want to get this lady into delivery, and Elvis is doing his psychic healing. Then he asks the doctor, "Can I come in the delivery room? I have never seen a baby born. I want to see life." Well, the doctors finally said no, but they were thinking of letting him, especially when this lady kept on pleading with them to let Elvis Presley see her give birth. Some people, man, Sonny West says that Presley is convinced he has the power to heal people. He will lay on his hands and say that their strength and the power of concentration will draw out the pain. Red relates, "Since my days playing football, I've always had a bad back, and sometimes at the top of my neck it gives me hell. Well, after a while I learned not to complain about it when I was around Elvis, because I knew it would happen. Whenever he knew I had the pain, he would ask me to sit down in front of him, and then he would lay on his hands, telling me over and over that the pain would go away, that he was drawing out the pain. Well, I would sit there and he would say, 'It's going away, Red. The pain is going away. It's going away, Red. You're going to be okay.' I would say, 'Yes, boss, I hear you.' Then I would tell him, 'Hell, man, you're right. The pain has gone. That's fantastic. It really has gone.' He would give me one of those little secretive smiles that told the world that he had these powers, and he would walk away pleased with himself. I would walk away and my back and neck were still hurting like hell. It was a case where I didn't want to tell him that he was kidding himself, because he really had the best of intentions, but he was convinced that he had fixed me up. In Vail during a holiday that Presley was on, All the boys were out on the slopes at 3 o'clock in the morning, horsing around. We were on those snowmobile things, says Sonny. Well, Dean, son of Dr. Nick, was along with us. He often travels with the team and helps out in various ways. A real nice kid. Well, we were on these disc sleds, and somehow Dean's went skidding out of control and he hit a fence and hurt his leg. We thought it was broken, because he was in a lot of pain. We carried him back to the chalet and laid him down, and he was groaning in pain. Then old psychic healer Elvis comes along. He starts laying on the hands and grabbing the leg. Poor old Dean is nearly passing out with pain, but Elvis is convinced he is fixing the leg. Now, as it turned out, it wasn't broken, just a very bad bruise, but if it had been broken, Elvis's fooling around and grabbing it could have got it worse. When Elvis heard from a doctor that the leg wasn't broken, he gave one of those satisfied little no, all smiles, and he said, I know, it isn't broken, it's okay now. He was taking credit for the fact that the leg wasn't broken. Dave Hebler, who has a cynical sense of humor, sometimes found it difficult not to laugh at Presley. Like the others, he would indulge him no end, but he was always battling with his laugh button. Man, I remember one day at the Palm Springs house in Chino Canyon Road, says Dave. It was hotter than hell, over 100 degrees. Anyway, Elvis wants to suddenly hop in the car and go down to the shopping area to load up on some stuff. When he goes, everyone goes. We all jam into this car. There were 4 or 5 of the other guys along. God, it was hot. Elvis was talking about the power of metaphysics, although I'm not quite sure whether he knew the real definition of the word. Anyway, the sky is desert clear. Not a cloud in the sky except for this tiny little cloud a long way away which was minding its own business. Suddenly Elvis yells out, stop the car. I want to show you what I mean, Dave. Now see that cloud? I will show you what my powers really are. Now I want you all to watch. All of you, look at that cloud. Well, we all look at the damn little cloud up there like a bunch of goats. Elvis is staring a hole through the damn thing. Well, the perspiration is dripping off us. Not a sound in the car. Just a whole lot of dummies dying of heat stroke looking up at the cloud. I'm near dying and I am praying that the son of a bitch would blow away. At the same time, I'm really having a problem not to burst out laughing. Well, after about 10 minutes, thank God, the damn thing dissipated a little. I mean, if you watch a single cloud, anyway after 10 minutes, it will move or dissipate to some degree. I saved the day by noticing it first, and, because I didn't want to die of dehydration, I said, gee, Elvis, you're right. Look, it's moving away. That was just the right thing to say. Old Elvis gave me one of those sly little smiles that told me he had done it again. I know, I moved it, he says. Then we drive off, Red West. Perhaps because he saw the miracle of Presley's rise to the top from the very beginning, is not quite as cynical as Dave. He remembers driving across the desert in a Dodge Mobile home trailer that Presley had bought. It was just after we made the movie Wild in the Country, and we had a group along with us. Elvis was making it with this girl he had met on the movie, and she was along, and Larry Geller was there, too. Larry was his permanent hairdresser. He was one of the best and most expensive in Hollywood. It was Larry who first interested Elvis in a lot of psychic phenomena books. He was into it. Anyway, we are driving back from Arizona. Now in those days many of us used to follow Elvis and popping those damn amphetamines just to keep us high. But, I swear, on this day I hadn't taken a thing. I was very straight. Now we are talking about some of this heavy psychic stuff, and Elvis is talking about how he believed he was destined to do something very big in his life apart from show business. I'm agreeing with him. Anyway, suddenly just to show me what he is talking about, he says, hold on, Red, stop the trailer. Look up there, see what I mean? Anyway, I look up and I'll be a son of a bitch. There is a giant cloud formation above us, and I don't know whether it was auto-suggestion or what, but this cloud formation is formed in the shape of 2 very definite likenesses of 2 heads. One was Elvis Presley and one was Joseph Stalin. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm a candidate for the funny farm, and I don't know whether it was my imagination, but I know what I saw very clearly. Elvis Presley and Joseph Stalin. Wow, that shook me. And I said to him, quite sincerely, yeah, sure, boss, I see what you mean, and I'm not going to say that I don't believe in a lot of that stuff. Some of it is pure crazy, but there are too many unexplained things to dismiss it completely. Presley knew that Red felt Presley's control over him, and he would often write him kind of fatherly letters containing advice and psychic philosophies. He would sometimes dictate such a letter to Linda Thompson and have it delivered to Red by hand. Red remembers one in particular because, he says, it shows you how he had to be the dominant figure. He wasn't content to let his show business status speak for itself. He had to have control. You were his subjects. You did what he said. He even called us disciples. That comes in with the Mike Stone incident, adds Sonny, I thought he was trying to get my mind to go kill Mike Stone and putting the gun in my hand. I thought he was trying to overpower my mind. Sonny says that when Presley talked about his powers, he would say that the pain was being transferred to his fingers and that's why he had the ability to cure with hands. Presley, who was brought up in the First Assembly Church of God, knows the Bible extremely well. He would often sit with his legs crossed yoga fashion and read to his Memphis Mafia and their girlfriends for hours. At other times he would mix Bible teachings with philosophy. His favorite book is Voice, which Sonny says is one of the many books on highly complicated philosophy that Presley has with him all the time. But Elvis often gets up in his acts during his performances and reads these things to the audience, says Sonny. One night at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas, he got up there and stopped a whole performance. Don Rickles was in high gear doing his insult act. Rickles decided to introduce Presley, who was in the wings. Sonny recalls that Presley could hardly wait to get on stage, and when he did, instead of saying the perfunctory hi to the audience, he produced Voice and insisted that Rickles read passages from it. It was an extremely embarrassing scene. What could Rickles do? He didn't want to insult Elvis, so he read on and on until he looked at Elvis and said with a smile, "Hey, where are we going with this?" Presley looked at him, dead serious, and said, "Keep reading, Don, it's very important." Sonny was embarrassed for Elvis. Jesus, was I glad when the reading was over. The audience clapped politely, but they didn't know what the hell they were clapping for. 99 Sonny recalls how Presley would tell his boys how his powers went beyond healing humans. He says Sonny, that his powers could be transferred to bushes and trees. He would have this gimmick where he would put his hands and fingers over a little bush or a leaf. Then he would move his hands back and forth in a vibrating motion. Well, after a while, of course, there would be movement in the air, and the bush or leaf would move naturally. Now I would do it, knowing that the movement of his hand had actually moved the leaf. I would stick my hand out stiff, and if I moved it, I would move it slowly. And, of course, nothing happened and I would say, "Gee, boss, I can't do it." "How did you do it?" "Well," old Elvis would smile that smile of his and he would say, "I can do it and so can you. But you're going to have to learn how it's done." We weren't ass kissing. It's just that he is so certain of these powers. You don't want to throw it up in his face. It's like spoiling someone's fun and we just went along. None of us would ever want to rain on his parade. Dave Hebler relates. Now, there are experts in the psychic phenomena field who are very hard to discount. A lot of their stuff stands up, and I am tempted to believe in it quite a bit. But with Elvis, while I believe a lot of his homegrown philosophies, it's quite obvious he has only a very surface knowledge of this stuff. The ludicrous part was him passing himself off as an expert, particularly in this healing business. I think he sincerely wanted to heal someone's pain, but at the same time he was trying to elevate himself above ordinary humans. He sort of had this Superman complex. There were times, says Sonny, when Presley, halfway through a Bible reading, would stop and interpret, and change the wording. There is a passage somewhere in the Bible which mentions that a rich man, if he is only rich, cannot get into heaven. Well, Elvis turned that around and would tell us, the Bible says that a rich man's chance of getting into heaven is like a camel's ass trying to get through the eye of the needle. Now that wasn't meant to be funny. We weren't supposed to laugh at that. Then he would say, "Well, the Bible didn't mean it that way, because I'm rich and I'm going into heaven." We would always nod our heads and agree with him. What really would break up the Memphis boys was Presley's way of preaching. There was a time, says Sonny, in one of his homes, it might have been down in Palm Springs. Anyway, Elvis was all dressed up, and there was a period where he would carry a cane. Actually, they were sword canes, and some of them had daggers in the bottom of them. Anyway, we're all gathered around, and Elvis with this damn cane jumps up on a coffee table and he starts giving us the Sermon on the Mount. But the way he gave it was a little different from the Bible. He stood up there and held his hands up for silence, and in a loud preacher's voice he yelled down to us as we sat around with our faces turned up to him. "Whoa, all ye motherfuckers, of kind thoughts and good deeds." He went on in this vein and it really was funny. There were a bunch of girls there sitting on the floor, and when they saw that we weren't laughing, because we knew better, they kept their faces straight like they were in church listening to a sermon. Anyway, he starts talking about Moses and he says, his voice still like a gospel preacher, "Moses, that white-haired son of a bitch, comes running down from this big mountain." Now his damn hair had turned white because he had seen the Lord, and those things can happen when you see the Lord. Anyway, he came on down from the mountain, and how he got down was the burning bushes directed his ass on down. Sonny recalls that the Bible teachings were really a scream, but nobody dared laugh. Presley was deadly serious. Sonny recalls, he doesn't realize he is saying these things. His mind is always running very fast, and it jumps ahead of his talk. And sometimes he doesn't know what he is saying and he says the first thing that comes into his mind. He would say the funniest things in quoting the Bible. Now whenever he mentioned Jesus, he would just say aside, Now, Jesus, he was getting it on with Mary, the woman at the well, you know, Mary Magdalene. It ain't in the Bible, but it's true. She got stoned, but Jesus took care of her and they traveled around a lot together. Red West recalls. He would say, Jesus said he was old and of age and he fell ass backwards in the dust. Later on, after we got together, we would laugh our heads off because it was hysterical. The boys say that he was fascinated by intelligent people, just so long as he wouldn't get into all that other bullshit, says Dave. He had a very good and very inquisitive mind. When he'd hear somebody tell a story that interested him, he would absorb it, build on it, and make it into a whole monologue. Typical, says Red, was an incident attached to the song Softly, which is one of the songs he would sing on stage. Now, one night backstage, some guy who was feeding Elvis a line said, "Do you know this story behind that song?" And Elvis pricked up his ears and said, "No, I thought it was a love story song anyway." This guy tells him it wasn't a love story. The lyrics, this guy says, were written by a dying man. Elvis gets to thinking about this, and, as is his way, he will often talk to the audience about the he is going to sing. So he has made up this incredible story. We heard him tell it on stage so many times we started to get to where we believed it. He would get up there and tell them, "Now this is a story about a man who is dying. He was in the hospital and his wife was there with him. She sat with him for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 3rd day, she lay down beside him and went to sleep. Just then this man felt himself dying. He didn't want her to see him pass away, so he reached for a pad and a pencil and he wrote these words, softly. Then he would sing 9, the song. Well, I guess the audience ate it up. Anyway, I spoke to a guy who knew the writer of the song and told him this story, and the guy looks at me and says, "Oh, bullshit, it's a love story." But Elvis to this day will tell that story on stage. His imagination is great. Elvis firmly believes there is life on other planets. He believes there are flying saucers and that visitors from other planets often come down to Earth. When he started talking like that, Dave Hebler says, he never got much of an argument from me. I mean, it's pretty arrogant of us here on Earth, a tiny little planet in this giant universe, to think we are the only ones here. So I would listen pretty closely to his ideas, and they often went along with mine. Sonny West remembers a time in 1966 when Presley believed there was a visit from outer space. It is still a bit of a mystery to me. We were back in his mansion in Perugia Way, Bel Air. We were in the back of the place, and suddenly Elvis says to me, "Do you see that?" I looked up and I could see this light coming through the trees. Elvis was getting very excited and said, "It's a flying saucer." I didn't take much notice. I thought it was the light of a plane or a reflection from a plane, and I just waited until I heard the sound of the motor. Well, I didn't hear any sound. The light kept coming, and it went through the trees and sort of over the top of the house. The light disappeared, and it seemed to have dropped in the front of the house and we were in the back. Elvis tells me to go back in the house and get Jerry Schilling. I rush in, grab Jerry and we go outside looking for the light. When we got outside, we couldn't find Elvis. We're hollering and yelling, and we run in front of the house and we still can't find him. Finally I hear him yell, "I'm down here." We run down about 2 or 3 houses, and he is in the driveway of one of these houses. He is looking off toward Westwood. I say to him, "Jesus, that light thing scared the hell out of me. I thought they had got you." When I said that, I was only half joking, because I believed I had seen some kind of flying saucer or a phenomenon of some kind which I can't explain. Anyway, he just kind of grinned and he said, "They will come but they won't hurt us. If they make contact, we can't be afraid, because they are not going to hurt us." He was convinced there was a flying saucer with people on board, and I don't know what I believe, but I do know I saw something I can't explain. And I agree with Dave. I can't believe this Earth is the only planet with life on board. Sonny and Red believe that a lot of Presley's mysticism started with his mother's and father's dreams. Like his mother, who dreamed that his car was on fire and was right. Elvis told us about his dad, who also had these weird dreams and would walk in his sleep, like Elvis did, says Sonny. He told us of a time that his dad had this dream that the house was on fire. So his dad jumped up and ran toward where Elvis, who was 3 years old at the time, was sleeping. He grabbed little Elvis, and he thought he was throwing him out of a window to escape the flames. Of course, the house wasn't on fire. He threw Elvis out of his cot, and Elvis landed butt first against the wall. Red remembers that once, the teenage Presley sleepwalked right into the street in his underwear. A girl he knew saw him and yelled out to him. It woke him up, and when he saw himself there in front of the girl, he was so embarrassed he ran off and hid until she went away. When he first went to the Hilton International in Las Vegas, there were nights where I sat up awake all night, just sitting by the window, while Elvis was asleep. I just stayed there, because I was scared to hell he would walk in his sleep and jump out the window. It was a genuine fear. There's a lot of strange things to Elvis, a lot of any strange things. That's why I don't believe he is ordinary human. 15. On September 26, 1958, the U.S. Army's most famous recruit sailed from New York on board the U.S. troop ship General Randall bound for Bremerhaven, Germany. With the death of his mother hanging heavily in his heart, Private Presley kept pretty much to himself during the voyage. But there was one soldier who struck up an acquaintance with him, a short, sharp-looking guy from Alabama, Charlie Hodge. Presley felt secure in the company of a fellow Southerner, and besides, Private Hodge played a good guitar. For 4 days they talked and sang together. Today Charlie is still playing guitar as one of Presley's musicians. He has become so closely identified with the star that he even has his own fan club. When the Randall arrived, the cold, gray docks of Bremerhaven had never looked so decorative. There at dockside, behind sturdy fences, were 1,500 shrieking Fräuleins waiting for their hero. Harassed army officials whisked Presley and his fellow soldiers off to their camp at Freiburg. Meanwhile, the Presley rearguard action was about to rendezvous with their leader. Vernon Presley, Minnie Presley, Red West and Lamar Fike were on their way. The first thing Vernon did, says Red, was to organize a place for the whole of us to stay together. It had been agreed that Elvis could live off base, which was no special privilege, really. I mean, it wasn't against Army rules if you could afford it, and naturally Elvis could. Well, Vernon organized this place to stay in Bad Nauheim. It was a hotel. Now I have read stories saying that this hotel was a luxury hotel. Well, it wasn't. It was called the Grunwald Hotel, and as soon as I saw it, I knew it really wasn't the place for us to stay. It was a sort of outpatient's hotel for heart attack victims. There wasn't anyone there under 60, and every one of them looked like they had one foot in the grave and the other one on a roller skate. Anyway, we get this 3-bedroom apartment with a living room, kitchen and bathroom. Grandma, Vernon and Elvis would sleep in the bedrooms, and Lamar and I would bunk down in the living room, which was more than fine by us. Now, Grandma, who is still alive, thank the Lord, and must be now about 82 or 83, is a real character. She had never been outside Tupelo, Mississippi or Memphis. She had never flown before, and here she is with a superstar grandson, her son and 2 men. She is real down, home country, and if you think I have a southern accent, you should hear her. Well, as soon as we land she started getting dreadful reactions to the vaccination shots. The vaccination scab on her arm was the size of a $50 coin. The poor old girl's arm swelled up to twice its size. She couldn't get out of bed, and for about a week there I thought maybe we had done the wrong thing bringing her, because I thought she was going to die, and that would have finished Elvis off. Well, from death's door Grandma seemed to come out of it. She was tougher than 10 horses. In about a week's time she was ruling that house like a real southern lady. She did the cooking and cleaning, even though there were chambermaids. Thank God for those chambermaids, but I'll explain that later. When she got well, we were all one big family, and I was sort of raring to go to enjoy myself. But then whenever I went downstairs and saw these people who looked like they were going to die, I sort of had second thoughts. This was not the place to have fun. Although, looking back, we did have a ball. All of us, particularly Elvis, like the Germans. They weren't Southerners, but they were kind of straight people who were very honest and looked you right in the face when they talked to you. One guy who particularly looked us in the face was the manager of the hotel, Herr Schmidt, who wasn't too happy about our invasion. He obviously thought that after we were there a while, there would probably be a few corpses on his hands. I'm surprised there weren't. Herr Schmidt was a strange guy, who used to be followed around by this ratty half-breed dog. Trouble started straight away for the Presley party. There was this old gal below us, Red continues, and as soon as Lamar walked around, she would thump on the ceiling and shout something in German. Lamar would respond by jumping up and down on the floor, yelling something about Hitler. If it didn't kill her off, it damn near killed Vernon off. He had visions of the publicity if ever we got thrown out of the hotel, which, of course, we eventually did. Private Presley rose at about 5 a.m. every morning and headed for the base, where he was assigned to the scouts. It was, naturally, an ordered life, but occasionally something would go wrong or else a superior officer would hassle him. That's when Elvis got in a bad mood, Red recalls, and he would say, "Man, what the hell am I doing here? That old son of a bitch the colonel, he could have got me out of this. He could have fixed it, but most of the time he fitted in well." Quite obviously, the big attraction straight away was the women, and the women were as frantic there as they were here, but, generally speaking, the German fans seemed better mannered. I mean, you could joke around with them, talk to them without getting ripped apart. Of course, there were exceptions. Red remembers their fun at the Grunwald Hotel with affection. We never stopped playing games. Each week we would have a different kind of fight. We always had water pistols, and Elvis, Lamar and I never stopped fighting with these water pistols. We would be in the hallways of this hotel, squirting hell out of each other, And suddenly we would see some old broad look at us with shock like she was about to drop dead from a heart attack. And only then we would stop. Then there were the shaving, cream fights and the pillow fights and all the time pushing and wrestling each other on the floor. When I think of it, me, Elvis and Lamar wrestling on that floor, I often wonder how long after we left did that old girl underneath us live. I'm sure we shortened her life. 99. The best time of day, particularly for Red, was early morning. Now that's when the chambermaid would come in to make up the bed. I would give her a quick roll in the hay, and then she would go back to work. When Red and Lamar weren't having water, pistol fights and shaving, cream fights and pillow fights, they would spend their time in the Beck's Beer Bar, around the corner from the hotel. I guess I was there more than Lamar, but I couldn't do much damage there, because I never had any money. Both Lamar and I were back on Elvis's payroll, which meant we didn't get paid. We got our 3 square meals a day and we had a roof over our head, so I guess we couldn't complain. We were there because we wanted to be there, and nobody forced us. But the most we got was a few marks here and there, and in Germany in those days a mark was worth about 25 cents. So I would go over to the bar and nurse 2 beers all night. When Red wasn't doing that, he admits, he got into a little bit too much trouble in the Beck's Beer Bar. Always seemed I was getting into fights. Some guy would say something, and one thing would lead to another and things started to get a bit physical. It was pretty stupid, I guess, but hell, I was only about 23 and didn't know much better. See, Elvis wouldn't go into a bar and drink, and he just didn't figure that a guy needed a few bucks here and there. We did plenty for him, and he guessed we were happy with just being there serving him, which was right. But a few bucks would have helped because there was no way we could do any work there to earn any money. Red admits that he had himself to blame for the way Presley relied on him to do odd jobs. For instance, at night sometimes, when I had nothing to do, I started polishing Elvis's army boots. I learned all that spit and polish stuff in the Marines, and Elvis really started taking a pride in his dress while he was there in Germany. Well, I showed Lamar how to shine his shoes, and between us we would have those boots of his so shiny you could have shaved in them. He got used to it where he expected it, but we didn't mind doing it. While Red was making an impression on some G.I. Joes at the Beck's Beer Bar, and Minnie Presley was making her impression on the kitchen, and Presley was making his impression on the U.S. Army, Colonel Tom Parker was not actually dozing himself. He had thwarted all attempts to have Presley put in the special services, and Elvis's fans were now resigned to hearing only silence for the next 2 years. So Colonel Tom had RCA Victor release the movie album From Love Me Tender. When that reached the saturation point, the album Loving You was released, followed by King Creole. All were million sellers. Then some of the old songs were released and brilliantly repackaged. Presley may have been up to his knees in snow in Germany, but he was still warming the hearts of his American fans. News stories and pictures in U.S. newspapers and wire services about Private Presley were doing their work, too, and, predictably, an older generation was gradually seeing Presley in a different light. No more was he a swivel-hipped menace to womanhood, but a clean-cut Southern boy out doing his duty for his country and his flag. By the time he returned to the States, he was every parent's idea of what a good son should be. Up until then, no singer had ever managed to appeal across generations, but Colonel Tom wanted everyone to want his boy, not just one age group. He wanted him to be around for decades, and that is exactly what happened. Red recalls that RCA Victor was frantic. They wanted to keep the ball rolling. They wanted him to cut a disc in Germany. When that idea was hit on the head, they even pleaded with him just to sing a song into an ordinary tape recorder. They would do the instrumentals and the dubbing back in New York. But the old colonel, I guess he knew what he was doing and he knew the time wasn't right. Presley would never be snowed by pressure. No matter how he was harangued to cut more discs, he would politely shake his head and say, "Just take it up with the colonel." Fun and games at the Grunwald were reaching raucous proportions. Herr Schmidt had a suspicion that one of his chambermaids was doing more to the beds in the Presley suite than just making them. Lamar Fikes marching around the suite was pushing the old lady underneath closer to her maker, and Red and Presley had gone just a little too far with their water, pistol, shaving, cream and pillow fights. If I remember rightly, says Red, the straw to break the camel's back came when Elvis and I are having a shaving, cream fight. I kept hitting him in the face with this stuff, and he ran into one of the rooms and locked the door. I guess I was too satisfied with this, so I put some paper under the door, lit it and decided to smoke him out. Well, you guessed it, it caused a little fire. Nothing serious, I don't think, but there was a lot of smoke coming out of the windows, and Elvis and I are dying laughing as we try to put this damn thing out. Suddenly Herr Schmidt, the manager, appeared on the scene. He was one very pissed off German hotel manager. I thought he was going to explode. Meanwhile, All the old biddies are running around downstairs thinking that they are going to be barbecued, no matter how bad our German was. We got the drift of Herr Schmidt's strangled shouts. He said one word in English very good and that word was out. Vernon was pissed off as well. But old Minnie Presley, funny old gal that she was, she thought it was very funny. She had never had so much fun. A decision was made to move into a 3-story, 5-bedroom house nearby on Goethestrasse. Red remembers it was a comfortable, big, old place, which the landlady charged an arm and a leg for. She saw us coming, man, says Red. We paid close to about $800 a month for the place. That was a gigantic amount of money for Germany in 1958 and 1959. It was at least 3 times what a German would have paid for it. The landlady was a gal we'll call Frau Gross, which is not her real name. A big, busty broad who could have played linebacker. We take over the place, move in and find something very strange. Even though we're paying the rent, Frau Gross decides she doesn't want to move out. One of the main reasons for this was that she very much liked the idea of men company. Not Elvis, but his dad, Vernon. He didn't want to be alone with her. She would rattle away at him in this very fast German and Vernon would just nod his head. She never stopped talking to him, but not a word of English. He didn't understand a word she was saying, but she just kept talking and smiling. It was very funny. But what was funnier was to see her and Grandma Presley together. Now Grandma couldn't talk Yankee, let alone German, but Frau Gross would be in the kitchen and she would talk to Grandma in her German and Grandma would talk back to her in this real Mississippi country accent of hers and, man, they would talk for hours. It was a scream. But Grandma didn't like anybody trying to take over her kitchen. One time there was a dreadful confrontation, and Grandma decked this big Frau Gross with a broom handle. Oh, lordy, what a house. Presley and Red had a passion for fireworks and, on occasion, would engage in fireworks fights with local German youths. Once, Presley accidentally sent a Roman candle into the back of a young German man, who told Presley that he had put a hole not only in his leather jacket but almost through his back. When Presley offered to pay for a new jacket, there were no more problems. Elvis liked the Germans for that sort of thing, because if that had happened in the States, someone would have sued him for $100,000. He liked the Germans, the way they didn't make a fuss about things like that. They were good people. Presley was cementing U.S.-German relations in other ways, with the women. I remember one day, says Red, I saw this pretty little thing out by our front gate. Now I had just went out there and said hi and we couldn't communicate at all. But I just said the word Elvis and pointed up to his bedroom. We didn't say another word to each other. I smuggled her past Frau Gross, who didn't like other women, particularly young women, around her house, and I just put her in Elvis's bedroom and left her there without a word. Elvis came home a little later and I just said, hi, I've got a present for you upstairs. He looked at me, shrugged his shoulders and didn't say another word. Well, he came down about a half hour later, and he had a smile on his face that just about split his head in half. Little presents like that tend to break up the day. Red remembers one particular girl whom Presley got hot and heavy with. I can't remember how we met up with her, says Red, but what I do remember was something that would never happen in the South even today. This girl took him home with her to her mother, and that night he slept there with her mother's blessing. I know it must have shocked the hell out of Elvis. Those things didn't ever happen to him. I guess she was a pretty liberal mother. Presley felt very much at ease with the Germans. He and Red would go into the park with young Germans and roughhouse with them. It was like sort of friendly fighting, says Red. No punching in the face but wrestling each other and throwing each other on the ground and tackling each other. Nobody went too far and the German guys were having as much fun as we were. I remember one time we were battling with them and having a ball. We were getting swamped by them. Elvis pokes his head out from under a pile of legs, arms and bodies and yells to Lamar to come and help out. Well, there was some ice on the ground and Lamar is on top of a hill. Old Lamar yells out, I'm coming Elvis, I'm coming. Well, he came all right. Lamar slips flat on his ass at the top of the hill and slides from the top of the hill, the whole 300 pounds of him, right past us where we were wrestling. And he keeps on going like a great big giant human sled right to the bottom of the hill. Well, that broke all of us up. Elvis, me and the German guys went hysterical. I've never seen anything like Lamar. It was like he was jet propelled. Old Lamar didn't think it was funny. He climbed back to the top of the hill with his ass out of his pants. Lamar was always doing something like that. Somehow he didn't mind being the clown. He was a great guy who was just so funny without even trying. And he had a heart of gold, too. Other diversions consisted of football games set up by Presley and Red. Some of the GIS they played against were to become college football stars, and a few of them even made the rookie pro ranks. The only thing about this field where we played, says Red, the most dangerous thing about the game, was the fact there were a lot of shepherds in the area. Well, we would have to stop our game as about 100 sheep would pass over the ground. Only problem was that half them damn sheep would take hay in the middle of the field, and we found ourselves crap playing ankle deep in sheep shit. 99 Presley spent some of his free nights fairly quietly at home. Charlie Hodge, the southern boy Presley had met on the boat to Germany, would drop over. So would another southern boy, Rex Mansfield. Together with Lamar and Red and Vern, they would all get together for an old-fashioned southern night singing and harmonizing around a fire, with Minnie Presley cooking up heaps of southern food. It was like a big family and we enjoyed ourselves. Red remembers. Rex Mansfield ended up by marrying a beautiful little American girl called Lizbeth who worked with another girl handling fan mail. It was a pretty tight group, even with Frau Gross hovering in the background. The mail that Presley was getting was staggering, something like 10,000 letters a week, some of it just addressed simply to Elvis, Germany. All of them were answered. Red remembers that, despite the rare complaint that Colonel Tom could have gotten him out of the 3rd Armored Division, Private Presley was a good soldier. He took the job seriously and asked for no special treatment, and the guys really liked him. There were a couple of alerts that sent Elvis right up to the East German border, where he could actually see the commies on the other side. One time there was even talk that shooting might start up there, and Elvis was right along there, up to his ass in snow and as gung-ho as the rest of them. Because he was so well received and because he made an honest commitment, Presley would get particularly annoyed if he thought any superior officer was picking on him. One particular incident I remember, says Red, was to do with the BMW sports car that Elvis used to drive. The Germans called it an Elvis wagon. Anyway, he was driving off base, and when he got to the gates, this big MP starts giving him hell because there was mud on his license plate. He just jumped all over Elvis for no real reason. I mean, he was just trying to show off that he could push Elvis around. Well, Elvis came home and he was in a bad mood. He was saying, "That son of a bitch of an MP tried to embarrass me for no reason. I'd like to kick his ass." 9.99. Red had never liked to see anybody push Elvis around, whether it was in Hume's high school or in the United States Army. Presley gave Red a description of the offending MP, and it clicked in Red's mind. I knew who the big son of a bitch was. They called him Indian, because I guess he had a bit of Indian blood in him. Anyway, I recognized him from the Beck's Beer Bar just across the street, where I hung out. I just said to Elvis, "I'll just go check it out." Red went across to the bar and within a minute had found the MP who gave Presley the business. When Red walked over to him, the Indian knew right away he was in a spot of trouble. Red's reputed tie-in in the bar had preceded him. "I want you to come with me," Red said. The MP looked up from his beer. "I know what it's about," he said. "I made a mistake." "Well, why don't you come with me and we'll talk about it?" Red replied. Red took the Indian back across the street to the house, and presented him to Presley. "Is this the guy who was giving you all that shit?" Presley nodded. "Now," said Red, "why don't you two guys go into the living room and talk it out?" Red closed the living room door and stood outside. "The next thing I know," says Red, "this guy comes out with a rag in his hand, and he goes out to Elvis's sports car and he cleans the license plate himself." Elvis just walked out with that little grin on his face and it was all over. What did Presley say to the MP? Did he threaten him with Red's awesome reputation with his fists? "I don't know," says Red. "I don't want to look like a badass. I just fell into the situation and handled it. To tell you the truth, what I really think happened was that Elvis gave the dude $100 to go out there and clean the license plate, and then Elvis would look good in front of me, as if he had handled it himself. That was the only problem that I recall. Of course, there were girls always chasing him, but he was pretty cool about them. He chose his broads pretty carefully. I remember one time there was a little carnival nearby, and Elvis and I and Lamar went along. We were just playing around when suddenly a group of girls recognized him from a long way off. They charged. Elvis and I took one look at them and started to run for our lives. So we're running like hell and just then a bunch of GIS go past in an open car. Without saying a word, we just dived in the back of this moving car to escape. Unfortunately there was Lamar running like crazy to catch up. He couldn't make the car and was running so hard across the street he couldn't stop himself. Well, he crashed right into a wooden fence. You should have heard him cuss when he got back to the house. You could always rely on Lamar for comic relief. While at the Grunwald Hotel, Vernon Presley met an attractive blonde army wife. Her name was Devonta D. Stanley. She was married to Sergeant Bill Stanley. Red remembers the first meeting very well. She was a very pretty woman in her 30s. She had 3 children, Billy Jr., David and Ricky. Billy was about 5, and David and Ricky, I guess, were only about 3 or 4 years old. She introduced Vernon to her husband, Sergeant Bill. He was a pretty nice guy, pretty typical career, army type. Well, Vernon got so thick with the two of them, he would go out with them, like a triple date. They would go out drinking together and they were good friends. Well, when Sergeant Bill was on maneuvers, He didn't mind Vernon taking Dee out if she was lonely. Well, I guess one thing led to another and Vernon and Dee got involved. I remember one night Vernon, Dee, Sergeant Bill, Lamar and I went out on the town. We all got pretty swacked, but Vernon and Bill really got drunk. We all ended up at Sergeant Bill's apartment. Luckily Sergeant Bill Stanley just passed out in his chair. Because things were getting rough, Vernon was mouthing off. David and Ricky were crying and I put them to bed. Anyway, Lamar and I, over the protests of Vernon, just dragged him out of there and bodily carried him to a taxi. He was cursing and yelling that he was going to have us on the first plane back to the States. But just as well we got out of there. Because if Bill Stanley had woken up and heard all this going on, it might have got out of hand. He didn't know that Vernon and Dee were more than just seeing each other. Of course, from then on it was pretty obvious that Dee and her husband were going to split. Because Vernon and Dee got pretty close. Later on they got married. Vernon's relationship with Dee Stanley didn't please young Presley. It really got him pissed off that Vernon would marry again, says Red. But he would always say calmly, "Whatever Daddy wants is okay by me. Whatever makes him happy." But the truth was, he never liked Dee Stanley. The thought that Vernon was replacing his mother really burned him up. It wasn't anything he talked about then, although he did later. 99. There were two habits that Presley picked up while he was in Germany. One of them was a fascination with karate, a passion that became an obsession. He would practice karate for hours on end with Rex Mansfield, who willingly acted as his karate dummy. In years to come, someone's enthusiasm for the sport often qualified him for a place on Presley's team. The other habit wasn't quite as innocent. As Red recalls, there were times on maneuvers up close to the border when the GIS really had to be on their toes, and they wouldn't sleep sometimes for a long time. Elvis knew a sergeant, whom I'll call Sergeant Johnson, which is not his real name. Well, Sergeant Johnson wanted his men to be sharp, and he didn't want them falling asleep at their posts. So from time to time he would give out these Dexedrine pills to keep his men awake. Now, Elvis had never had anything to do with pills or booze up until that time. He still doesn't have much to do with booze, only occasionally. Presley really took to them pills, says Red. He liked what they did for him, and he started taking them regularly. So did we all. On some of those movies we made we were higher than kites all the time. But Elvis didn't stop at Dexedrine.